Hi. I wanted to do something a little different, or a little novel for me at least, which is discuss a little bit or share some of the things that we often work through in coaching. The kinds of topics that come up for my clients that we discuss and that we work together with. This is just an off-the-cuff conversation, so we'll see where it goes. I love audio, I love podcasts. I listen to them all the time. I find them really useful and convenient to listen to while I'm cooking dinner. I find them really informative, and honestly also I find them really self-soothing. I listen to a lot of podcasts to help me sleep. So I hope this is useful to you in some respects, whether it be informative or insightful or self-soothing. And I think we're going to do a whole bunch of different topics, but what I would love to touch on a little bit about today is when change arises. And I've certainly known change. My clients certainly know change. That's often why they've started working with me. But how do we move through change with as much grace and compassion and make the most of that opportunity or the possibilities that often present themselves in these transitional phases to move towards something better? How do we support ourselves and those that we love who might also be being affected by this change, such as children, partners, family members, friends, communities? And how do we move closer towards what we want and grow and transform in a direction that feels nourishing and rewarding to us? You know, sometimes change happens to us, and we are forced to change by external factors. And sometimes we get this, or we have this internal knowing or this calling that we need to make a change. And sometimes we have this knowing or this calling for a while, and then life pushes us from the nest. I've had all three happen to me. And, you know, I think in a traditional coaching model, people might start with immediately jumping into goal setting or brainstorming what they need to do to build their action plan. But I honestly don't find this the most useful place to begin. We might move there eventually. However, often we just begin by acknowledging what is arising for us. How are we feeling? And that can look like many things. And those feelings can often come in waves, and it can feel quite cyclical almost. And we can kind of loop through various emotional states. And each of those emotional states is valid, and each of those is information for us that is useful for us. So the first thing we always begin with is acknowledging how we're feeling, what's coming up. That can look like anger and resentment. It can look like grief. It can look like powerlessness or hopelessness. It can look like anxiety, fear, Hopefully it can also sometimes look like excitement, it can look like freedom or joy. But often it's complex and there's multiple things arising. The thing about change is that it brings up our relationship with the unknown. And for a lot of us, what we do with that is project all our pain and our fears onto that unknown. But it is unknown. We don't know what exactly is going to unfold. So it is a projection. However, that's a really, really useful place to start because it often gives you an insight into where you still have hang-ups about things. And also, what is your relationship with uncertainty? Because a lot of change is about our relationship with uncertainty. And what I find really useful and really necessary is trying to ground ourselves in the present moment, because these emotions can feel like they really take over us. And we can feel like we really lose our level-headedness. The thing about our pain bodies, or those things that have a lot of emotional charge for us, is that we may be Buddha 90% of the rest of the day, but when they take charge or when they really take hold of us, all our strategies can go out the window. So as much as we can, we want to return ourselves to groundedness. And there are a few ways we can do that, or a few ways we do this in clinic. The first one is just by tapping on either side of the body. This self-hug creates a container for ourselves. It feels self-loving. And the tapping just anchors ourselves in this moment, this present moment. We can also ground into the floor. I use that a lot, and sometimes I get my clients to push into the floor to help ground themselves. It's really nicely done when you're standing up, particularly if you're also in nature. I think because it connects you to the bigger ecosystem and it makes you realize you're part of something bigger than these individual problems you may be having. And the third one is the breath. And the breath is so useful, and I think everyone should have a breathing practice. But particularly being with your exhale. And when we're with our exhale, we can ride out a lot of the emotional waves that may be coming. And center ourselves in this kind of third space, or this space where we have a lot more spaciousness around those emotions. Because a lot of those emotions, if we sit with them, can feel quite young. I'll take myself as an example. Sometimes when I'm going through periods of change, and it's not all the time, I have actually love change, I love growth, I love learning. So a lot of change feels really good and really exciting to me. And actually a lot of what feels really stagnant or intolerable is a lack of change, or is things getting too comfortable, which is my own, I have a whole other issues about this. That can also be its own issue in itself, where we're constantly on the move because we're addicted to change. But for me, when certain kinds of change arise that feel really sticky, I notice that they come in waves, and I will cycle through helplessness, which is this complete state of collapse where I want to just go be in the corner of the room, make myself as small as possible so no one will notice me. That's how I feel safe. And that's a really, really young embodied state. It's almost pre-verbal for me. Like it feels so young, it feels like it was before language, before I had the capacities for language. I then cycle into this sort of scrappiness, which is also a young energy for me. It's about 4 or 5 years old, which is no one dare make me feel powerlessness or offend me, I will burn the world down if they make me feel that way. And you know, that has been another important survival mechanism. However, I'm also fortunate enough with enough time and with enough sort of training and with enough skills now that I can recognize this third space, which is this space of self-adulting, which is a lot more compassionate and it's a lot less fast. It's much slower, it's much more grounded, where I can recognize those cycles that I move through with those two states, but that I can be with them without pushing them away, loving them for what they're offered, but not letting them drive the bus. And letting them be here and seeing them, but not letting them take control. For people who have a hard time where the body doesn't feel safe to go into, and this can feel particularly true when people are particularly stuck in anxiety or overwhelming emotions, or if they have a trauma history, sometimes we don't go into the body. It's not that useful. The emotions are so big that sometimes we actually need to turn away, in a sense. And so what we'll do is we'll notice external things. For example, I can regulate someone's emotion by getting them to notice me and by drawing them into conversation with me, whether they realize that or not, because I am reflecting to them a more regulated state that they can mirror. I'm not perfect by any means, I'm not God, yet I am a more regulated state that they can fall into alignment with. Sometimes we'll get them to notice things in the room where they are, such as, for me, this beautiful plant here. It's so green and luscious and alive. And it's not about trying to stare at the plant, but rather just almost letting the plant come to me and softening my gaze. And just noticing that there is this thing that I'm drawn to, that feels good to look at, that I'm curious about. And so I scan the room for things that feel good or that draw me in, or that I can come and rest on, that feels relieving. You know, I have this Frankie Knuckles poster, and that brings me so much joy because Frankie Knuckles is an amazing DJ. And just being with that poster just feels really good. And often when we are just with these things, it offers us the spaciousness around these other emotions, that we're not pulled into them. We can see them, but we're not drowning in them. We're not sucked in. And that in itself is such an important state to be able to come back to again and again, particularly when we're going through periods of change, because there are many, many moments in change where it feels like we're ungrounded. And you know, change often brings up identity crises. We can feel like we're losing the ones we love, or we can be scared to lose the ones we love. We can be scared to lose the safety of this container that we're in, this nest. Even if when we know the nest isn't particularly where we want to be or particularly good for us. And you know, I see this a lot in health coaching, particularly, you know, often we want to make a change, and yet at the same time we can be afraid of making a positive change for us, because we can be afraid of the way that that may play out in our relationships or in the way that we live our life. You know, classically, and I don't work personally with addiction, but when people are recovering from alcoholism, classically, when they commit to abstaining from alcohol, often it can cause a bit of an identity crisis where they feel like they're losing the community that they've come to know. And they need to make new friends around this new activity. Now that is a big example, but it happens all the time, even when we're making small changes. For example, when people want to be doing more physical activity, sometimes they can be concerned about what that might mean for their relationships with their loved ones. Particularly if they have kids, would that be perceived as being selfish? What their partner may feel about it, you know. Sometimes those fears can be grounded in truth to a certain extent, and sometimes they can be complete projections. Often they can be complete projections, and honestly, sometimes we do go through periods of change and growth and realize that this job is no longer working for us, this relationship is no longer working for us, this place that I'm living is no longer working for me. What I see a lot when we have had the rug pulled out from under us, or we are going through change, or we are dealing with uncertainty, is this desire to shift into really binaristic thinking. For example, 3 years ago or so, I moved to Portugal, and that was answering a calling in me that I had been noticing for a while. Some might say forever in an extent, but also definitely since COVID, when I had to close my clinics and focus a lot more time on my creative practices, in particular on my writing. And, you know, I began to feel like this life that I had built for myself, and I had built it for myself because I was working for myself, was no longer fitting quite right. It was no longer giving me all the satisfaction that it had once given me, and it had given me so much fulfillment and so much joy. I loved working in clinic one-on-one with people. It's the most meaningful work I've ever done. And initially, I worked a lot and I was never tired. I loved it. I would get into flow state on the regular, on a nearly a daily basis. I was so energized and inspired by working with people going through degrees of change and seeing the amazing things people are capable of. And then from about 2021, I began to notice, or 2020, that it was no longer filling me up in the same way it once had. And it was interesting to notice my mind begin to make everything out as bad, particularly once I moved to Portugal, made the commitment to move to Portugal. You know, I closed my clinic, moved to the other side of the world. I had no job lined up. I was working on a novel in a new country with new friends, with a new language. There was a lot of change. There was almost nothing that didn't change in many ways, materially, structurally speaking. And it was interesting to watch my mind begin to try and make out the past as bad. You know, I made the chiropractic profession out as bad, that it was never meant for me, that I got burnout and the healthcare system is broken and all these things. And there is a kernel of truth in some of that. I do feel some of that, and I did experience my own burnout in a sense. And yet at the same time, it was much more complex and nuanced than that. And let me just go on the record by saying I loved clinical practice. I still love it. And it wasn't all bad. It wasn't an ill fit. It brought me so much aliveness and joy and connection and positive things. And then at a certain time, it was no longer a right fit. Change was coming to something that I loved, and I could no longer ignore it. And this is often how change arises. And sometimes we can see where we're heading, and sometimes we don't have clarity around where we're going. Sometimes we can definitely get clarity, like it's particularly useful to know when change is arising. Questions I ask my clients a lot of the time is, well, what's really changing? Because often we've jumped to chapter 10 and we've predicted the worst case scenario happening, when really what's arising in this moment is, or what's changing in this moment might not be as extreme as that. It can also be really useful to ask, what do we really know about what's changing and what don't we know? Because as much as it makes room that there are still things that we don't know, there are uncertainties here, it offers us certainty or clarity around what we do and don't know. And that in itself can be relieving, and it can give us agency, and it can help us begin to find possibilities and nuance. And I think the other one that can be really useful when we're going through change, well, 3 other things. Self-compassion along the way is huge. You cannot have too much self-compassion. Slowing down. Slowing down, really, really useful, because change can often make us speed up and make us move in a million directions. Where actually, change is an opportunity to get really clear around what we want and where we want to head next. And that requires slowing down a lot of the time. Support is so useful. You know, a conversation with someone else can be more valuable in 5 minutes than a week of trying to brainstorm your way out of this problem and doing Cirque du Soleil level mental exercises that may actually not offer you any kind of clarity. So support can be really, really useful. And then what I find a really useful inquiry is just asking, what do you want? What is it you would like? Getting really clear on that. And that's partly a cerebral exercise, but in many ways it doesn't come from our mind. It emerges from our bodies, and many times it's this soft knowing, it's this heart-centered knowing or this gut-centered knowing that we begin to listen to and we begin to notice. And I tell a lot of my clients that knowing what you want and desire doesn't happen overnight. It's a lifelong inquiry, it's a lifelong practice that you need to be in constant relationship with. Because particularly by the time change is happening, it can be increasingly hard to begin to notice what's true for us, because we can get lost in our stories. And so a journaling practice can be really useful, but also embody practices where you actually go after what you want. Sex, dancing, things that bring you joy, cooking food for people you love, watching comedy, going back to bed, getting into bed, particularly if you feel unsafe or if you feel threatened, going back to bed and having a nap. Most likely, most of the time, chances are you're not going to want to stay there forever. You are going to want to get out of bed and do something else. We have a lot of stories or a lot of narratives around desire, which often gets again in the way of our self-knowing. We think that it's going to make us a narcissistic asshole. And it's going to make us a gluttonous, lazy pig. When in reality, when we're in touch with our desires from a moment-to-moment embodied level, I don't find this to often be the case, and yet it can be really hard to unlearn those stories. I'm still unlearning those stories for myself. But often what we find, or what I find, is that when people go and have the nap, it's not that they want to stay in bed forever, it's that they then want to go be with their children, or with their partner, or with their loved ones, or by taking the art class, or joining the tennis group that they've always wanted to join. They're then wanting to go and be with their loved ones in a much more present way. Also, when we really be with ourselves and be with the ways that we want things, I find it doesn't often make us a gluttonous, lazy pig. When we eat bad foods, when we're really present with our bodies, what we often notice, what I often notice and what my clients often notice is that often it doesn't feel good. You know, we notice where our stop is. We hear that call. Sometimes we override that call and we continue eating. And then when we're really present with ourselves, what we feel is actually quite gross inside. We know that we've overindulged, or we've eaten something we actually didn't want to eat, or we've eaten junk food and that didn't actually feel good to us. It didn't feel nourishing. It didn't fill us up. It left us feeling quite empty in some senses as well. And, you know, after this call, I'm going to go clean my apartment because I want to, because it feels good to have a clean apartment. I've had some of the most gorgeous experiences doing the dishes quietly in a silent apartment, in my pajamas, in my slippers, and then climbing into bed. We want to do these things when we allow ourselves to be really present with ourselves. We want to do these things. And I offer this to you because often it feels like with change that we're being pushed out of the nest. But if we can have something we're being pulled towards, it can put us back in the driving seat. It can give us back our agency. And so asking ourselves, what do you want? What would you like? Where are you headed? Can feel really, really good. Still scary. Certainly still scary. But it gives us something to work towards. It gives us a new structure to begin to build. It gives us the seeds of something that we want to grow. And that can be really grounding when we have had the rug pulled out under our feet. Anyway, that might be enough talking for now, for today. Hopefully some of this is useful. Wherever you're at, whether you're grappling with a change, whether you're within a process of change, whether you wanted that change to happen, whether you feel like that change is happening to you, whether you feel like that change is happening for you, if you're considering a change, if there are things that just don't feel quite right and you can feel the call and you're wondering about heeding the call, I hope some of these reflections have been useful to you. And if you enjoyed it, let me know, and I'll monologue about something completely different next time. Until then, take care.